Matt
Great.
Crighton.
Thank you, Pat. It's great to be here. It's really nice to be at a radical independence campaign meeting, and I'll come back to that. I should say I do work with Friends of the Earth Scotland, and it is an organisation you can join, and I'll come back to that. But I think I'm here just as me, and I'm a me as a socialist and, as some of you know, an activist over some years. So what I'm going to talk about is how the left should relate to the issues of climate change, in my opinion, and how we build a movement which is sufficient to deal with the challenge of climate change. And in between that, I'll get in some stuff about the current political issues and challenges in Scotland today. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Right. And I'm also guessing that if you're here, you don't need the spiel about why we have to deal with climate change. Has anyone never been to a meeting about climate change? Right. No. I wish there were more who said yes, because that's bringing more people in. But it's a great relief as well, because I'm not prepared for that, and I would have to have lots of fancy slides and stuff like that. However, just to reiterate, we do understand, I think, that climate change represents probably the greatest challenge or crisis for humanity, or at least one of the greatest challenges for humanity. And for people of the left, I would just summarise it by saying, if we don't fix the challenges of climate change, forget all your other aspirations for a better world. Right? Under the impact of entire systems of sustaining populations drying up or getting flooded or whatever, under the impact of migrations which follow from that, under the impact of impoverisation, and the wars which will be the consequence of that, we're not going to stop struggling for social justice and equality, but it's really hard to imagine that this is going to be a good condition for achieving those objectives. I think what I wanted to start by saying is we should just share the fact that dealing with climate change and the issues around climate change don't fit very well with a lot of the frames which most of us bring to this, especially looking around the age of most of the people here. We can go into the detail, or we can express it ourselves in our own way. It doesn't fit very well with the sort of the socialist narrative that I was brought up with. It doesn't fit very well, very simply, because that's a very quick summary of why that doesn't work terribly well. It's because we've been for more consumption by working people, the people of the world. We've been for more stuff, right? Earning more wages because of an unfair division of wealth and income and so on. And it's been completely right. People's living standards matter, and we've been for more of that. And more of that stuff creates more emissions, and that creates the problem that we're dealing with. I would suggest that it doesn't fit very well with a nationalist perspective as well, because quite clearly it doesn't respect borders. You cannot have a narrow, I'm not saying anyone in this room has a narrow nationalist position, but from a nationalist point of view, it really isn't fixable in Scotland. Right? You've got to address how you challenge this and deal with this on an international scale, and again we can come back to that. And I would also say it kind of didn't fit very well with or many of the mainstream channels of modes of thought within the environmental movement. And I'll just illustrate one of the things about that. There's a long debate about the left and the right and environmentalism, and again, it's really interesting. But one of the sort of syntheses we have around how socialism and labour movement, trade unions, and environmental issues come together is around that environmental issues are the health and safety issues which you have inside your factory but outside it. It's about the health and safety, like poisons in your own workplace will also poison your community. Carbon dioxide is not a poison, right? It's like neutral, it's completely you can breathe as much of it in this room as you like and it won't do your health any harm at all. It's just an example of one of the ways, again, you decide what you want to talk about at the end of this, but actually I'm saying none of those, it was an issue none of us were looking for, it doesn't fit very well. And so part of my thing I'm going to talk to you is about my own passage through that. But just have to say, we can't choose, we cannot not respond to this. as socialists, our responsibility, if you are a socialist, if you're radical, left, whatever, aspiration for the better world, our responsibility is to understand the world as it is and address the issues as they present themselves to us. And I will say, another narrative, I think almost the entire left has failed to do that sufficiently well up until this moment. Another discussion we can have. However, as you know, if we don't, we're kind of fucked. I think it's the best way is just to come through this. Like, what do we need is to come through my own way through this. Back in 2005, imagine me, socialist, working in local government, unison activist, union activist, quite heavily involved in campaign for nuclear disarmament, and I come across this issue. I mean, I can't even remember how I did, but I just thought, like, comrade, what's the line on climate change or global warming? Is right. And I gradually, quite rapidly came to the awareness that there was no sufficient answer for the kind of the reasons I've explained, because it doesn't fit our narratives very well. And so the people I respect, people I thought knew a lot more about it, both didn't have a good answer to what we do about climate change, but also weren't bothered. That was quite scary. My journey is about asking the question: is what is sufficient to stop climate change? Not just can we make it a bit better, but what will deal with this problem? Because what I found in the environmental movement at the time was, let's kind of circle this. Let's sort of get this into the political world, but let's not tell the whole truth, because it's too scary, and the politicians will just react away from this. So what are the methods which will work economically, but also work what you might call socially and politically, that we can get from A to B? How can we sort of practically understand an A to B to C to D, which involves how do we get people on side for dealing with this, and people not thinking, I'm resisting this because it means I can't have my holidays in the summer and so on. It was also for me a process of making it relevant within a trade union. And so within a trade union, anyone who's active in the trade union knows that the basics of trade unionism is you look after, defend and advance the interests of your members. And the interests that your members are thinking about are not about climate change. No. They are about the conditions in their place of employment. Obviously they're very, very absolutely integral to trade unionism as a vision of a better world. I don't personally dissociate them from, but your average member is, it's like sort of part of the movement in a sort of less engaged way. And so I think it's a really good test. It was a good test to say, how do you write a motion about climate change that your union branch gets it? And so how you're connecting from these big issues to the things which concern them. So that's another part of my sort of process to do that within Unison. Unison, good union, quite open to policy. So, policies I wrote got through into Unison, and I think we can see, not just me, but we can see that individuals writing motions in their branches, going up to Scottish level and so on, it does have an effect. So this question about sufficiency is like technical. How do you basically get to a zero carbon economy? What technologies do you use? How do you eliminate burning fossil fuels from transport, from heating homes? The stuff which, again, we can spend. Probably you've all thought about, but that's a technical question. But there's also like the political question: who will solve this for us? Will anyone solve this for us? Are there any solutions out there which look like it's going to work, or do we need a mass movement to impose solutions on the system as it's working or failing to work? And that's what I want to come back to, and that's why we'll come through to Lorna and at the end. And so I'll say that I don't know, just an old-fashioned way of thinking about things. You get involved in an issue, you join the organisation which appears to be the sort of the best approximation to part of a mass movement. And so I joined Friends of the Earth in Scotland, and without sort of going into it very much, as I said, I didn't think at the moment, to start, even the environmental movement had a sufficient set of responses. And I think part of the challenge, the process over the time is, I do think Friends of the Earth Scotland is on top of the issues. It's an important part of a mass movement. It's not the only part of the mass movement, but I'm going to get back to, you should join. I'll get back to that. And then the last thing I'll sort of put out there, this is like a sort of Cook's tour of the stuff, isn't it? Internationalism, right? So that, you know, it cannot be resolved locally. You have to get your head round what you have to do locally and how you make that part of an international movement, which has enough power to change the world. We've always wanted to have a mass movement with enough power to change the world, so we're at ease with that idea, but pragmatically, and especially in the balance of forces politically at the moment, it's like, oh, that's interesting, you know, how do you, and so we can come back to that question of how does a mass movement which is sufficient to stop climate change is related to a mass movement which is sufficient to make the world a good place for everybody. So I'm skimming through all this stuff, and we could have a meeting on each one of these subjects. So that's my sort of what I wanted to get onto is, but basically, I think those are the key components of what we need for this this challenge. It's a set of what's the word? Like a set of pragmatic, practical proposals which show how it's possible to move to a zero carbon economy without making everyone live in caves and wear sackcloth and ashes and stuff like that. We need to engage popular movements, trade union movements, and so on. And so we need to make the solutions which we're offering popular. They need to be things people think, we've got to fix climate change, and in doing so, other stuff will get better as well. So a positive as well as a more negative narrative. That mass movement's really important, and the internationalist stuff. I want to move on to about how we articulate that in Scotland today, and run through a few of the political issues. But that's my pitch, is the cause of is what's driving the continued growth of emissions, even though we're talking about. However, it isn't endemic to capitalism alone. It's about burning fossil fuels is not a characteristic of capitalism, and nor was it a characteristic of it is what we did before capitalism as well. So that's just the first point. But I do agree personally that there is no capitalist solution to climate change. No. And that's a crucial point, because I think we should understand that the world's ruling class doesn't actually want climate change. It just doesn't know how to stop it. It has not got the capacity to control its own economy in a way that can. It doesn't want to burn its own planet. It's, if you call it a ruling planet, they own the planet. They don't want to burn it. However, they can't stop it. So I think the duty is, our responsibility as socialists is, through articulating how you can stop it, to develop the power over the economy, which is basically power over the economy for social goods and social objectives is pretty much getting close to the idea of socialism. So if we can just leave that one there for the moment, I think it's a really good set of questions to talk about. But that's my I think two places are my feet in two movements: the trade union movement and the environmental movement. And I think it's been a very constructive engagement between the two of them. And one of the things is that the environmental movement, let's call it the climate change movement, has had to understand what Pete said. You will not stop climate change unless you address social and equity issues as well. And probably more than elsewhere, Scotland, the environmental movement in Scotland is quite good on that. I'll just come very briefly to that. So what I'm going to do is, very quickly, so that Lorna can get in. I just should not sort of sketch out what's going on in Scotland at the moment. Scotland has world-leading climate legislation. Pinch of salt time, but it was good. The 2009 Climate Change Act, good. Right? It did things like including aviation and shipping, which other people didn't do, and stuff like that. Set targets, which were challenging. The current situation is that those targets have to be revised, they've got to be extended further, and they've also got to take into account the Paris Agreement and the recent IPCC report on what you need to do to stick to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade, or at least have a chance of that. And so the current situation is that the government has proposed getting to 90% of from the baseline, a 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and other targets back to 2030 as well. We're saying that's really not enough. Right? That is not ambitious enough. We've got to have, first of all, a net zero target of either 2050, we say for instance, it says 2040. You've got to set up a signal, amongst other things, of zero carbon is a place where we will get to, because that's a signal to everybody that the game is up for fossil fuels. I'll come to that. So we are in a struggle at the moment, a political struggle, about whether the Scottish Government, SNP, will buckle under the pressure which is coming from campaigners and other people and other parties but on a zero target, a zero emissions target. And there's lots of detail about that. There are other things we want to have in that bill, like a commitment to just transition, which I'll come on to, and like a nitrogen budget and stuff like that. So that's a specific set of issues. Other things which are coming through are this idea of just transition. That's what I work on. We set up the Just Transition Partnership between trade unions and environmentalists, and that's about saying, those are the targets. They will only be met if they look after the workers who are affected by that, quite classically workers in oil and gas, but not just in oil and gas. There's lots of workers whose jobs depend on burning fossil fuels. And like the point I was making before, we will only solve this problem and achieve those targets if it's popular and takes people with it, or in fact not doesn't take people with us, actually people are demanding it. So that's the Just Transition Partnerships, a big part of my work, and talk about that. One of the outcomes is that the Scottish Government has just set up a Just Transition Commission, which is to look at how to do this stuff. So Just Transition has got into this territory, and I think it's very good that we're now talking about Just Transition when we talk about climate change. If you want to know whether it's actually getting real or whether it's just words, you would look at whether it does get embedded in the climate change bill and then act as a sort of, this is how we approach these issues in Scotland. You would look at whether it is in the remit of the new Scottish National Investment Bank to fund this transition, and you would look at whether they're setting up, they're thinking of setting up a publicly owned, a state-owned, Scottish-owned energy company, whether the remit of that company is to drive forward the just transition. So those are the current political issues which is like the touchstones of which parties and which, whether the government is actually doing the stuff that needs to be done. I'm just going to mention two things and then stop. First of all, if the Scottish Government is serious, if we are serious about this, we have to face up to the oil and gas issue, and that is where you start to get into issues around the Scottish nationalist movement and so on, because it's always been Scotland's oil, and it's always been a bedrock of the future economy of a suggested independent Scotland. Essentially, to stick to climate limits and the Paris targets, there's got to be I don't know the exact figures, but we've got to have no oil coming out of the North Sea within 20 years or something like that, and it's going to be a really steep decline. At the moment, the Scottish and UK governments together are going hell for leather to get as much oil out as possible. We want it to go like that, they want it to go out like that, genuinely. And they can't really, obviously every politician can be hypocritical, but logically you can't hold both positions. And so, but it's also very, very challenging for us, because not only are there about 110,000 jobs in Scotland actually getting the stuff out and then dependent on it, they're well paid to unionise, or some of them are unionised jobs, and so if you take that out of Scotland, you've got lots of people who used to work there looking for other work. You've got a big gap. You've also got a big gap in the sort of industrial structure of Scotland, which is clearly a challenge for a nationalist narrative. It's not my problem because I'm not a nationalist, but it is my problem. But you know what I mean? It's got to be thought through in terms of an independent Scotland would have to resolve that issue. So that's a big topic of discussion. So projecting forward a just transition for oil and gas workers is again a big part of what we have to do and what I'm trying to think about at the moment. And we'll be producing a report quite soon, so I hope you'll look forward to reading that. And then lastly, this is where I stop. For all that period that I've been talking about, since I became engaged, I've been looking for the movement. I've been looking for the mass movement I can be part of. All I wanted to do was be part of a mass movement. I didn't want to sort of slave away at it. But that mass movement, frankly, on climate change hasn't arisen so much. But there are signs. I think there are signs that this is changing. And nothing can be not much more inspiring to me than 30,000 Belgian school students sort of protesting in presumably Brussels. Today, it's just like fantastic, and we know the history of that. The Gilets jaunes, now, the Gilets jaunes in France are sort of were put over as anti-climate change measures. What they were anti was the costs of climate change measures being imposed on working people while rich people were having their taxes reduced. And actually, the Gilets jaunes tell us exactly the point that we're making. You can't solve climate change if you do it inequitably. Crucial point. And then lastly, Extinction Rebellion. We're all fantastically pleased that Extinction Rebellion is happening, and Lorna's going to tell us about it. Is that good? Good at all? Yeah?
Yeah, that was a really great introduction. Thank you so much, Matthew. And I've got a PowerPoint here, and it's
I'll move out of your way.
Many thanks.
I'll move right out of your way.
Thank you very much. So basically, everything that's been said so far is absolutely right, and you've introduced that perfectly, because exactly what we need is a mass movement, and Extinction Rebellion is certainly one of those options at the moment. And just to give you a bit of background, I'm not a scientist, not like Matthew. I don't work for a charity like Friends of the Earth and so on. I actually work in education and in inclusion and equality, and over the years I have had a growing interest and passion and deep concern about the environment, to the point where I needed to have something that I could latch onto and join. And when I saw Extinction Rebellion, the moment I saw it in the Guardian and on Facebook, I realised that this was what I had been waiting for, in terms of finding that kind of catharsis of the grief and the anger and the sense of injustice. Someone actually defined anger as displeasure at injustice, and everything that Matthew has touched on so far indicates that climate change is not just an incredibly important issue for the planet that we live on. It's also an issue about inequality, and it highlights the inequalities that exist in the world. So here we are. So I'm just going to go to this next slide. So hopefully I'll be able to illustrate that the Extinction Rebellion, which is the super group that I have joined and have so much comradeship and, as I say, this catharsis, this ability to just share in this mass movement, this mobilisation of people to try and create this positive change and tackle climate change. So, intense emotions in the room. We've heard it already from the people that have spoken, and I'm sure that everyone else is feeling the same intense emotions. A bit of background about why I feel so passionate about climate change. My father was a biology teacher, and he fostered in me nature, whether it was nature or nurture, one will never know, a passion and a love for the natural world. He was always showing me harvestmen when we went camping, on the bottle, and showing me the plants and the bees and everything. And so I have a deep love for my planet and all the creatures that live on it, including human beings. So that is kind of where I'm coming from with all this. And I'm sure that everyone in this room has their own story about why they're here and why they care deeply about what's happening in the world and have to do something about it. So here's a few headlines which you might have noticed in the media. This one in particular, I liked, being a Glasgow person myself. Appealed to me enormously. It just shows that the lengths that people are willing to go to in Extinction Rebellion, and you'll have seen the kinds of things that the Guardian article that I was talking about back here. There's a picture of the activists. Now, can anyone tell me? Can anyone remember what this action was that Extinction Rebellion did down in London? Well, it was a group of people who went to, now I can't quite remember where we went to, but it was somewhere in London. Do you remember, David? David, where this action was, where they superglued their hands to the windows? Where were they?
I think it was government premises, one of the government departments.
It was, and it was like fossil fuels, it was energy, and it was a kind of energy related building. And basically they did this, and this made a huge impact on me because it brought home that idea of, you know, if we don't sort this out, this issue with climate change, you know, our house is on fire, as Greta Thunberg said. If we don't sort this out, the other issues are somewhat eclipsed, you know, in the world, and it's almost like the idea of, you know, kind of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic somehow for me. If we don't sort this out, so so I have actually got a wee video here, and I'm hoping it will play and it will get some sound. This was a video that I saw which kind of encouraged me to join up to Extinction Rebellion, so let's have a bash at this. If it doesn't...
Not a lot of sound.
It's no sound.
Just
There is sound.
We can do the chants because we were there.
There's subtitles.
Check the volume.
I need to escape from it.
It's Patrick Harvey.
That's Patrick Harvey there.
Could you go back just to the start of what Patrick Harvey said? Would that be okay? I just...
Yeah?
Sorry, the title.
I
I'm
think
just trying to
it's-
find out what you actually said there about the sort of limits of the political and economic system.
Is it okay? Can everyone see the subtitles? Can
Not
everyone
if they're
access
behind
it?
us.
Sorry about this, but we don't have sound. I'll try it from the
With a bit
beginning.
of rubber in it.
Really finished.
Seen him before, so.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So, it's just a nice wee whistle-stop tour of everything that Extinction Rebellion is about. So you know, I really hope that you feel the same way and you know, as strongly about the value of Extinction Rebellion as a mass movement as I do. And obviously, you know, Friends of the Earth as well. I mean, there are others in the Edinburgh area, and as Matthew said, it's just so important that we're tackling climate change and making the world a better place. You know, there's a lot more, you know, a lot about it. And also, the good thing about Extinction Rebellion is that it is on an international scale. You know, we do have, as well as nationally, we've got lots of different groups throughout Scotland. We also have groups in Belgium and, you know, different European countries. David here would probably be able to tell you which countries. Is it Switzerland as well?
What I do know is there's an online map that you can resize, and
Right.
it just shows all the known groups and where we should put South Africa and Ghana, as well as lots in the sort of New York area of the
Right.
United States.
Okay, so it's not just Europe then, so it's much wider than that. Super, yeah. So who are Extinction Rebellion? So formed originally in 2016 from the Rising Up movement, and then Extinction Rebellion itself formed in October 2018. A bit of background, sorry, am I going on too long here? Do you want to maybe stop and have questions again, just to give people a bit of a...
explain, because not everybody will know about it, so
Just go through, yeah.
5 minutes or so just to
5
do
minutes,
that,
yeah.
that sort of
Right,
thing.
perfect. So basically, just, you know, we are international, and we formed in Scotland in 2018. You know, this was following the London action that you've heard about, and it's a mass movement employing non-violent direct action. So, you know, it's somewhat different from Friends of the Earth and other groups, but it's the same non-violent direct action and peaceful protest that we're about. And I'll give you examples quickly of some of the actions that we've done. So, you know, this is an interesting thing. 3.5% of the population, Matthew said earlier, is that not everybody cares about this. And there's a graph actually that Extinction Rebellion have, and it shows you the kind of small percentage of the population that actually do care about this, that enough to act on it. And but that 3.5% of the population can affect change, so although it might be a very small proportion, it can bring about change. So what have we been doing? We did a protest in November 2018 outside the Parliament, and then we did very recent a Burns Day action outside the Scottish Parliament, and then we've got other actions coming up. On April 15th that week, there's going to be a week of civil disobedience. So there's our protesters coming out of the Scottish Parliament building, and there were no arrests, and they held a citizens' assembly in the Scottish Parliament building, and they read out the Declaration of Rebellion and the demands that you heard in the video. So just showing that commitment. So just to kind of highlight again what the demands are: the government must tell the truth about the health situation, and they must reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025, and the government must establish a citizens' assembly to oversee the changes. So just quickly have a wee quick look what our principles and values are. It's basically, it's a very, the core of Extinction Rebellion, and the thing that I love about it is that it is a very democratic organisation, and decisions are all made through affinity groups. It's not a hierarchical system. Decisions are made in groups, and an ethos of caring for one another as well, which is the most important thing really if we're going to get anywhere, isn't it? So holacracy is the social science behind the organisation. So the holacracy is this kind of thing that I've been talking about, and that's the kind of theory behind it. So a lot has gone into this. That's the kind of setup of the organisation. We'll be able to read that, but really just kind of it gives you the idea of the very detailed way that we have, that the organisation has mobilised people in these affinity groups, and local groups and national groups. So how can you get involved? David is here, and he can take any names and email addresses tonight if you're interested in joining Extinction Rebellion, and I really do hope that you do join us, and I think you'll get a lot out of it, as well as knowing that you're making a difference. So thank you very much. I'll just